We are in Fire Central here in Los Angeles. Even not being in immediate proximity to any of the wildfires, we can still see the smoke. We can see flames. We can see particulate matter invading our air. In some ways, it's almost like being in a post-apocalyptic scenario.
We are safe. We have not received an evacuation notice, although today Los Angeles County accidentally sent an evacuation warning, not a mandate, but a warning to the entire county by accident. So that was a little bit of a big oopsie, to say the least. It's been a pretty bad time out here. There are people without power. The air quality is really bad. Obviously, there are people who have lost their homes, lost their lives. It's a pretty terrible situation.
Yeah, the devastation has been enormous. It could well approach $100 billion of damage, but that's not the worst of it, of course. At least 5 deaths, and likely many more as they continue to sift through the rubble.
300,000, I think,
evacuees. Yes.
People have been ordered or warned to evacuate.
Over 300,000, exactly. Many thousands of homes and structures destroyed.
Yeah.
An uncounted number of persons injured. God knows what's going to happen to the ability of the good people of Los Angeles ever to get fire insurance or any other kind of insurance. It's going to cost as much as the cost of your home, the way things are going here now. Iconic landmarks have been destroyed, historic schools and museums, the Will Rogers Park, the Will Rogers House are absolutely devastated. They are in rubble. And, you know, for anyone with any kind of respiratory issue, there's really no good place to be in the Los Angeles area, because even if you're not near a fire, the smoke, the particulates are going to affect you.
The air quality where we are right now is 159, which is considered unhealthy. It's like every day now there's a new fire out here, and
right, you know,
I don't know when the end is in sight. That's the other big issue.
Nobody knows where the end is in sight, because the conditions of drought and heat and the Santa Ana winds, those high winds, are completely conducive to starting and spreading fires. And very small sparks can set off a fire almost anywhere, particularly as we learned in the foothills out in the mountains, right, Sam?
Yeah, the issue... I actually wrote this down because, I mean, although some of this stuff is obvious, I think it's important to talk about. These are just the facts of the case. There are a few big issues that made these fires so bad. One is water. LA has no water, especially no fresh water, and there's been lack of rain, which I'll talk about. So sometimes the firefighters literally run out of water. They have to bring tanks of water into LA to try to fight the fires. The other second big issue is the wind. So the Santa Ana winds the last few days have been insane.
In the mountains, they've hit 100 miles an hour.
Right. I think they're the worst winds this decade since 2011 or around that
Since
time.
2011.
And the first few days, they couldn't even get aircraft up in the air because the winds were so powerful.
Right.
The other issue is the winds blow these embers and these particulates up to 2 miles. And if these embers land on a house, it can catch the whole house on fire just from one ember. Third big issue is rain. So it basically hasn't rained here
forever, a whole year, right? A year.
I think since the beginning of the rainy season, this is the lowest amount of rain Los Angeles has gotten since 1964.
I think it was 0.02 right?
inches of rain since the rainy season started, which is nothing, right?
Yeah.
So there's no rain. Everything is so dry. So essentially, anything that this fire hits, any embers that this hits, instantly burns up. The last thing that people need to understand is the humidity. So the humidity numbers the last few days have been super low. There's no moisture in the air, again, making everything catch fire much quickly. So all these climate related things. And the reason why the Santa Ana winds are so bad right now, Santa Ana winds get stronger when pressure and hot air flow through the desert and into the Los Angeles area. So it's been so hot this summer, so hot this winter in the desert that the Santa Ana winds have been faster than they have in 9, 10,
15 years. Yeah, I didn't know you were such a climate scientist, Sam.
I wanted to be
very impressive.
Prepared for today's show.
Yeah, Before we go any further, I want to give an enormous shout out to the first responders, to those folks who are flying those very dangerous planes and helicopters. My heart goes out to the firefighters on foot, hundreds upon hundreds of them who are risking their lives, going in proximity to the fires, again, spraying water and fire retardants. You know, we cannot thank enough to these brave men and women. Without them, God knows, LA overall may have burned, right, Sam?
Yeah, maybe. And it's so weird that the weather fluctuates like this. It fluctuates from one year of
that's what climate change does.
Torrential downpour to the next year of extreme drought.
People have to understand climate change produces extreme weather conditions of all kinds. And I'm not a scientist, but there's pretty much a consensus that climate change did create the ideal conditions, sadly, for the beginning and spreading of these fires. And this, sadly, is not an isolated incident. You got to understand it in the context of the devastation that climate change in many different ways has wrought all over our country. Climate change is no longer a theoretical, scientific model, although we still certainly have that, and that's very important. But it's here. It's real. And it's destroying people's lives. It's the wildfires in California and elsewhere. It's the extreme drought in places like Arizona, the extreme heat. It's the tornadoes that have ripped across much of our Midwest and border state areas. It's the extreme storms that have devastated our southern eastern states. Miami is sinking from climate change. Miami floods even when there isn't rain. Our coastal areas are in grave jeopardy from climate change. And of course, any tragedy like this is a test of our leadership. And our greatest leaders have risen to the occasion and used tragedies to put forth their empathy, their compassion, to bring us together as those who can understand the humanity that is threatened and the need to pull together to deal with these kinds of tragedies. And we've seen that on both sides of the aisle. We saw that with Ronald Reagan after the Challenger tragedy.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country.
We saw that with Bill Clinton after the Oklahoma City bombing.
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens.
And we have a similar challenge here. And prophetically, this challenge is coming precisely at the time when whose life are we celebrating, Sam?
President Carter, Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter. We hear a lot of talk about evangelical Christianity. Jimmy Carter lived it. He was our most devout president. He's taught Sunday school for his entire life. And the values that he shared with his students are the values he lived by. He believed that as a political leader, you had to be a moral example, and no one lived a more moral life than Jimmy Carter. He also emphasized the value of human rights and compassion and concern for others. And so, at the time when we're celebrating the life of Jimmy Carter, this poses a particular challenge to our political leadership, particularly to our new leader, President-elect Donald Trump, who also has said, in my second term, I am going to bring us all together. I am going to unite us to such a degree that you won't even have to bother voting in the next election. You can interpret that in different ways, but that's what he said.
It's time to put the divisions of the past 4 years behind us. It's time to unite. And we're going to try. We have to try. And it's going to happen. Success will bring us together.
And yet, in his first test of national tragedy and the legacy of Jimmy Carter, Donald Trump reverted back to his worst impulses. Instead of offering to help in any way he can, he sought to exploit this human environmental tragedy for political purposes. Trump blamed who, Sam? Who did he put the blame on?
I believe Newsom. Right?
Governor Newsom. Donald Trump jumps on this, tries to exploit it politically, and lies about it. He accuses Governor Newsom of creating the fires by failing to sign something, water conservation declaration, which would have brought all kinds of water to Los Angeles County to avoid maybe or combat this tragedy. No such declaration exists. There was no refusal of Governor Newsom to sign some kind of declaration that could have prevented this tragedy or mitigated this tragedy. He also claimed that California didn't have aircraft to spray water and retardants on the fire, when in fact they have one of the most extensive aircraft forces in the country to do this very thing. And they weren't flying not because they didn't have the aircraft. Why weren't they flying on that first day, Sam? Pretty obvious why.
They weren't allowed because the winds were too high.
Yeah, it was much too dangerous. And again, Trump exploits this with falsehoods to try to pin blame on his Democratic opponents.
It's really disgusting.
It's disgusting.
It's really gross. It's not just Trump. I've seen a lot of people on the right making statements about this fire. And it's like the word climate change is like Voldemort, like saying Voldemort.
You can't say it.
They just won't say it. They'll blame the fire on everything around the sun except for the sun itself.
Yes.
And as I went through the facts of the case, it is very clear that this is very much caused by climate-related issues that are out of the norm.
I completely agree with you. It's not just Donald Trump. In fact, although, I comment a lot about Trump because he is the leader of the movement, I've said many times, and please consult shortly my forthcoming book, Conservative to the Core, A New History of American Conservatism. It's coming out in the next few months, Notre Dame University Press, and I make the point that the old so-called mainstream Republicans are gone. The conservative movement, the Republican movement, is now nearly 100% MAGA. That's why, as you point out, all these other figures are doing the same thing Donald Trump is doing. If Donald Trump, let me finish, blipped out tomorrow, yes, his personality is, unique and kind of dominates things, but the core of the movement would not change one whit.
Yeah, and let's also just call a spade a spade. Republicans have been in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry for decades. And the fossil fuel industry, as we know from science, has been probably the leading contributor to the climate crisis on planet Earth. So
100%.
Let's not forget
Plus, they knew about climate change decades ago, just as the tobacco companies knew about the dangers of cigarette smoking. And they suppressed it. They concealed it. They kept it from the American people because what is it that motivates the very rich above all else, Sam?
Dinero, baby.
And what's worse is to fight climate change, you got to tell the truth about it, right? You can't be telling lies. And we are abandoning truth-telling. What did Mark Zuckerberg of Meta just do?
Didn't he end the fact-checking?
And the fact-checking and hired, some new right-wingers who are committed to these mythological views of our history and our country. In state after state, Republican governments are cracking down on what teachers like me can teach, virtually forcing us, contrary to the overwhelming thrust of modern scholarship, to teach Republican orthodoxy on American history and contemporary American society. So, to combat climate change, and really deal with any other fundamental human problem, it starts with telling the truth, and truth is under enormous assault. There is one basic scientific truth about climate change. It's not a Republican truth. It's not a Democratic truth. It is a scientific truth.
Right. Yeah, it's concerning. And, you know, as Trump rises to power, it feels like we have no control over the truth anymore. And it seems like nobody cares about the truth anymore. And Trump can go on TV and say whatever he wants about the wildfires and whatever he wants about climate change and
or anything else. About Roe versus Wade, about the 2020 election.
And it seems like the media is not going to hold his feet to the fire anymore about this kind of stuff. Because, again, they're so worried about both sides and meeting in the middle. It's like the truth isn't in the middle. The truth is the truth. It doesn't matter which side it's on, if it's in the middle, if it's up or it's down. You have to call people out on the facts of the matter. It's just frustrating. And I think I'm especially frustrated because, you know, I'm living in Los Angeles where seeing the effects of climate change with our own eyes, we can read the statistics and the facts about the weather changes, and still we're in this post-truth world where nobody seems to believe it, nobody seems to care. Our president certainly doesn't care, and it's really demoralizing.
It's opposite of the president not caring. The president believes it is in his political interest and in the interest of his rich buddies and donors to deny climate change.
Yeah.
Regardless of its effect on his constituents in the country.